Now, the UK Supreme Court has ruled that the legal definition of a woman is based on biological sex. The landmark decision comes after a long-running legal battle between the Scottish Government and women's rights campaigners. The ruling could affect whether trans people are allowed in some female-only spaces. Well, in announcing the decision, the Deputy President of the Supreme Court, Lord Hodge, acknowledged the sensitivity of the debate.
The Court is well aware of the strength of feeling on all sides which lies behind this appeal. On the one hand, women, who make up one half of our population, have campaigned for over 150 years to have equality with men and to combat discrimination based on their sex. That work still continues. On the other hand, a vulnerable and often harassed minority, the trans community, struggle against discrimination and prejudice as they seek to live their lives with dignity. Lesbian women who have historically suffered marginalization because of their sexual orientation have entered the debate. It is not the task of this court to make policy on how the interests of these groups should be protected. Our role is to ascertain the meaning of the legislation which Parliament has enacted to that end. The unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex.
Well, Lord Hodge stated the court did not believe the decision undermined wider legal protections for transgender people.
We counsel against reading this judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. It is not. As I shall explain later in this hand-down speech, the Equality Act 2010 gives transgender people protection not only against discrimination through the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, but also against direct discrimination, indirect discrimination and harassment in substance in their acquired gender. This is the application of the principle of discrimination by association. Those statutory protections are available to transgender people whether or not they possess a gender recognition certificate.
The Conservative Party leader, Kemi Badenoch, has given her reaction to the ruling.
Sex has always meant biological sex, and what we have seen is a lot of people misinterpreting the law. They've had guidelines from all sorts of organisations that actually do not follow the law. So I really welcome this judgment. We need more. We need better clarification in legislation. The Equality Act could be improved. When I was Minister for Equalities, I was working on legislation to actually clarify that sex in the Act meant biological sex. And I think this is really a victory for all of those women who've had to go to court to fight for rights that they already had.
Sasha Deshmukh is the Chief Executive at Amnesty International UK, which intervened in the Supreme Court case on legal protections for trans people. I asked him why they had been involved.
We're part of a global movement of 10 million people around the world and work in over 70 countries around the world. Our role, wherever we are around the world, is to work on the protection of rights and to protect against discrimination, harassment, discrimination of any type and prejudice for any people anywhere within the world. So that's why we involve ourselves in human rights cases around the world, including the human rights considerations in this case.
But given that the UK Supreme Court has ruled that the definition of a woman is based on biological sex, their gender at birth, and given that Lord Hodge, one of the Supreme Court justices, said that he did not believe that this decision undermined wider legal protections for transgender people, do you feel that trans people will be reassured by that, even though this ruling may not have been clearly what they wanted?
Well, I believe that the law as it stood, the Scottish Government's position, was consistent with the protection of rights and protection against discrimination and protection against prejudice as the law stood. But I do think it's critical what Lord Hodge and indeed the Supreme Court unanimously said within this judgment, positively affirming the protection against discrimination, against harassment, against indirect discrimination, and indeed giving a number of examples in the detail of this judgment for trans people. Now, do I believe that it's very important in what is a very febrile public debate, sadly a public debate where there has often been misinformation communicated in that public debate, that instead of that misinformation incorrectly interpreting what this means for discrimination, those points from the court are emphasised. Absolutely, I do. It's for government, it's for public policy makers, it's for everyone involved in public debate now, I think, to be clear, absolutely clear, how those anti-discrimination provisions will be absolutely strongly enforced, and indeed to protect the trans community right across this country and trans individuals across this country from any discrimination or prejudice by anyone who tries to use this judgment as a justification for doing so.
Sasha Deshmukh there. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Let's return to that landmark ruling from the UK Supreme Court, which has ruled that the legal definition of a woman is based on biological sex. The Deputy President of the Supreme Court said that he didn't believe the decision undermined wider legal protections for transgender people. Let's speak now to our news correspondent, Katrina Renton, who's been following all of this for us. Katrina, hello to you. Just first of all, begin by giving us a sense of how significant this ruling is. We call it a landmark ruling. Why is it such a significant moment for the Supreme Court?
Well, Anita, this is about the Equality Act 2010, and that applies across most of the country. It applies to England, it applies to Wales, and of course it applies to Scotland, where this all started way back in 2018. So this has been in the courts for the last 6-7 years, and it's taken till today to get a judgment on it. It's gone backwards and forwards in the Scottish courts, and it's ended up at the highest civil court in the UK, of course, the Supreme Court in London, where judges were given the task to define what, in the eyes of the law, is a woman, and they unanimously went for the judgment that it is a biological position, that how you were born defines the sex that you are in terms of how the law is interpreted. Now, how did this come about? Well, the legal dispute began, as I said, in 2018. That was when the Scottish Parliament passed a bill designed to get gender balance on public sector boards, and they included trans women in that area, because what they were saying is that if you have a gender certificate, a gender recognition certificate, I should say, this is very complicated, that you would be, for the purposes of the Gender Recognition Act, acknowledged as a woman in the eyes of the law. However, there was debate over what the Equality Act meant. The question being that for Women Scotland said, well, would a trans woman have the same rights as a biological woman? And what would the impact on things like single-sex spaces be? So changing rooms, or hospital wards that are women only, prison spaces that are women only, those kind of things. So that's what the judges went to consider, and they decided that, of course, it was confusing the way it was, and they have come down on the side of biological sex is how a woman would be defined. Now, of course, we have to say that the judge, Lord Hodge, was absolutely unequivocal when he said that the ruling should not be seen as a triumph for one side over the other, and he stressed that the law still protected transgender people from discrimination.
OK, Katrina, thank you very much for that. Katrina Renton.